So anyway, without further ado, I think it's probably time that we start talking about all things fizzy. I do hope that as it's Friday, some of you have opened one or maybe two bottles this evening. I am lucky enough to have all six. I've opened the first three and then I'm going to open the final three when we get to them. But yes, the evening is themed around sparkling wines that are not champagne. Now, champagne to me is the equivalent of Jerry Halliwell and the Spice Girls or Sting in the Police. If you think of French fizz, more often than not, people will immediately think of champagne as the kind of lead singer, if you want to think of it like that, or a bit of a default position. Now, the reality is there is more champagne made than any other sparkling wine. So champagne makes 330 million bottles a year. And the other sparkling wines of France add up to only 85 million. Now, the reason I'm saying champagne makes is because champagne is a place. I'm sure many of you will know that. It is also a style of wine, but to be called champagne, it must be made in a certain way, the method champenoise, and it must be from the region of Champagne. The key difference about all of these, the Cremonts and other sparkling wines of France, is that they are not from Champagne. However, all of these styles that have AOC regulations must be made in the method traditionnelle, which Tim's going to talk a bit about later. So they're made in the same way as champagne, but there are some massive differences. One of them is obviously location, and we'll talk about that shortly. Now, whilst champagne is also the most well known, it's not the original. Sparkling wine was first developed in France in around 1530s. So some people say 1531, some people say as a little bit later, 1540s. But certainly the first recorded fizz, i.e. people describing the taste of effervescence or bubbles in their wine, was in Limoux, a region we're going to talk about later, and some Benedictine monks in Saint-Hilaire. They recorded tasting a sparkle. Champagne as a region did hone it, they refined it, they made it commercially successful, but certainly it wasn't the original. We're going to go down to Limoux a bit later and I'm going to cover that area, so I'm excited about that. So I've seen some of you already popping up in the chat talking about the affordability of Cremont and sparkling wines of France. Why is that? The reality is it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So champagne became so commercially successful, and from around the sort of 1700s, when things like cork and glass were all becoming usable in production of, making bottles and things that were strong enough to hold champagne. 1800s, 1900s, champagne really was a very good marketeer of itself. Because it was so popular, it became a really great commodity and an expensive product, because the demand was so high and the land that you can grow champagne is so small. The price of that land then rocketed. And so in theory, it is more expensive to produce champagne, but that's just because of the land more than anything. A little bit longer aging than some of the Cremonts by law, but as you'll see through some of these wines, they are made in just the same way of champagne. It is purely the land, and sometimes not even the grapes that are different. Now, lastly, it is not the Prosecco of France. I've touched on it, but it has to be made in the traditional method that Tim's going to talk about. Prosecco is made completely differently. So whilst the price might be more similar to Prosecco, they're really not that similar. Cremonts are more similar to Cava, to English sparkling wine and champagne. Prosecco is a whole other ballgame. We haven't got time to talk about it this evening, but there we go. So the regions that produce appellation, i.e. approved sparkling wines, there are 8 of them. We are going to cover 5. I was going to say 6, but we're not actually covering 6. We're covering 5 because we're doing one region twice rather. So if you're all ready to join me, I'm going to talk about the first wine before I hand over to Tim. And that is going to be the DOP, which is the Cremonta Alsace. So if anyone is tasting along this evening, then the Cremonta Alsace is our starting wine, and it's the Cuvée Julienne. Hi, Tim.
There have been a couple of questions as to the order that we're going to be tasting the wines in, so I thought I'd just clarify that. We are, as Anna said, going to start with the DOP, the Alsace. We are then going to head over to the Loire, then back east over to the Jura, and then we'll go through the Lemieux wines, and then finally finish with the Bergy Cerdon wine. So that's the order: Alsace, Loire, Jura, and then Lemieux.
It's a good old trip. And if anyone has got the email open, the reminder email or the email you got today has the correct tasting order in. So if you need it written down, then that's the place to go. Right, so let's start talking about the DOP wine, but also Alsace in general. Like the email said, we're going to use these wines to cover off regions, styles, grapes, etc. And not do proper tasting, although we'll talk about the wines, but we're going to use these as a guide because drinking and thinking is my favorite combination. So this DOP wine is actually a little piece of history. And when I say that, what I mean is that Julien DOP is the really the founding father of Cremonta Alsace. So in the 1900 Paris Expo, Julien attended and he came back and he tasted sparkling wine and he said, I want to make a sparkling wine in my region in Alsace. So that actually makes Alsace the second biggest producer. It was an early adopter and they certainly make a lot of it. So it's the second biggest producer of fizz by region after Champagne. And to put it in context, Champagne was 330 million, Alsace is 35 million. So a tenth of the quantity that is produced in Champagne. However, it does account for 1/4 of all of the region's wine production, which is really impressive. So a little bit about Alsace, and I won't go into too much detail, but I think we've got a map coming up which just will show you the long line of Alsace vineyards. They follow the Vosges mountains, so you have the Massif Vosges on one side, and then on the other side you have Germany and the Black Forest. And it creates, many of you will already know, one of the driest, one of the most perfect, optimum places to grow grapes, even though it is so far north. It's got this fantastic climate. So this particular wine is the most popular of the DOP stable of their sparklings. It's their sort of house flagship Cremont. It is a Blanc De Blanc style, so a white wine from white grapes, and I'll tell you which grapes in a minute, which is very typical of Alsace. It's had 9 months aging in the bottle on the lees, and Tim's going to tell you what that does to a wine in a minute. But sorry, it used to have 9 months aging on the lees, but they have actually recently extended the blend to actually allow for 24 months. So this has had 2 years sat on lees, so it's getting far more complexity than it used to, and it will have a little bit more of the nutty flavors. We did have a little slide up there on grapes, because whilst we're in Alsace, I'm going to really quickly whiz you through the idea of Cremont style wines and the grape varieties. This gives you an idea. It's a quick overview. Please don't worry about taking notes. If you're desperate to have this slide, we can send it to you afterwards. But it just goes to show you the different grape varieties that are allowed in all the different regions. Now we're talking about Alsace here at the top. So in Alsace, you're allowed Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, Auxerrois, Riesling, Chardonnay, and Pinot Noir. The red words are red grape varieties, and the black words are the white grape varieties, naturally. Alsace has quite an interesting combination, and if we go to the next slide, you'll see I've highlighted that Riesling is particularly interesting. Auxerrois and Riesling are not featured anywhere else. I've made yellow grapes that are unique to that area. So the one thing about Cremont that sets itself hugely apart from Champagne is that you are allowed these local regional grapes in the blend. So for anyone who's already a fan of Alsace, you'll know Riesling is one of the main contenders. Quite rare to get 100% Riesling Cremont, but you can get it. They tend to be quite zippy, quite pingy, whereas this is a much more classic combination. This wine here is 50% Pinot Blanc, which is a great grape variety. It has a little bit of nuttiness, so if you're getting a nutty flavor, that's to be expected. Good acidity, so it makes your mouth water, key for sparkling wine. And it's a bit of a chameleon grape. It behaves a bit like Chardonnay. So it takes on that lovely 24 months that it's had aging in the bottle with the yeast. So it's 50% of that grape variety, Pinot Blanc, and 50% Auxerrois. Now, Auxerrois, again, you wouldn't expect to get 100% because it's really about being a really good blending partner. And the Auxerrois adds body. And I can really get that in this. There's a lot more body to, say, a light, sort of zippy Pinot Gris style Cremont from the Alsace, which can be a bit lighter, or even a Riesling, which would be significantly lighter. So yes, I hope those of you who are trying it are enjoying it. I certainly like this wine. I think it's a really easy drinking, great aperitif wine. We've got sort of, for me, things like yellow plum, a little bit of apple, but it's not too serious. It doesn't take itself too seriously. That extra aging hasn't made it sort of over the top. It's just a really, really pleasant wine. So thanks. Tim, is it one for you, the Alsace?
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I think it's lovely freshness. Obviously, the acidity that Alsace naturally maintains in the wine just gives it a lovely freshness, and the blend of the grapes as well just adds a little bit of complexity and roundness as well. So to me, it's a really nice, balanced, well-balanced wine.
Perfect. Do let us know in the chat if you've got it open and what you think of it as well. We'd love to hear.
It's been a really nice spread of what people have opened tonight. Haven't seen too many people saying they've got multiple wines open, but potentially a few do. But yeah, it's lovely to see such a variety of wines being enjoyed this Friday night.
If you've got lots of wines open, then lots of sparkling wines, you need to give me the name of your dentist, because I'm going to have terrible problems by the end of this evening. The acidity is just going to create all sorts of havoc, but I hope some of you at least have one or two. Tim, speaking of one or two, I'm ready to try the celebration if you are.
Absolutely. So welcome everyone. I'm going to talk about the next two wines, which are the Cremonte Loire and the Cremonte Jura, starting with the celebration, the Cremonte Loire. And as I do that, I'm going to share with you a little bit about the processes of sparkling wine that we can see. So Anna has mentioned that the selection of grapes is really important in determining the style of the wine. I like to think of it as the grapes being the foundation that determine what is capable from being built upon from there. But a lot of what you actually see and taste, or the character and personality in wine, is determined by a series of important decisions that the producers make, or in some cases, the decisions that they don't make. One of my favorite lines about great winemakers is that they know that less is more, but in order to do less, you need to know more. When we get to the Cremonte Jura, I'll discuss that in a little bit more detail. But we're going to start with the celebration, which is a really important wine to the society. It is quite comfortably our highest selling sparkling wine by volume. Obviously, by value, the Society Champagne is our highest, but by volume, we sell more bottles of this wine than any other sparkling wine. It is, of course, a Cremonte Loire, and it's produced by Gratien and Meyer. Now, most members of the society will know the importance of the relationship between the Wine Society and Gratien and Meyer, or Alfred Gratien, which is the same company, but Gratien and Meyer is the Loire division of the company. We've been buying sparkling wines made by the Gratien family since 1906, so 115 years now. And it's a relationship that we really do cherish, and we love to celebrate that. And obviously this wine's name is The Celebration, which was the name we gave to it in 1988. And since then, so for the last 24 years, there hasn't been significant change in the style. The current wine, the 2017, is a blend of 50% Chardonnay, 40% Chenin Blanc, and 5% Pinot Noir. And then for the first time in about 5 or 6 years, this wine actually has 5% Cabernet Franc blended into it. Now, I know those percentages because I was actually with Joe Locke, our master of wine and buyer for the Loire, and Florence, the chief winemaker at Gratien and Meyer, for the blending of this wine in the 2017 vintage. So I travelled with Joe to the Loire in February 2018, shortly after joining the society. and was able to be involved in that blending process. And blending is such a vital step in the production of sparkling wine. Producers will have many different base wines that they will use to make a final wine. Champagne houses often boast of blending from over 110 different base wines, each vinified separately. But for this wine, well, before I get onto this wine, don't let that claim mislead you. Sometimes that is a little bit boastful. The values of the wines are such that it's very rare that they won't be used. So often what determines the blend is not actually what makes up the best blend, but what they have, and the proportion will change. But with sparkling wine, you're typically looking for a consistent house style. And to achieve that, they will use different parcels and also blend in different vintages. But this particular wine is what is referred to as a vintage wine, meaning it's only been blended from one particular year. For this wine, Florence had prepared our visit and had set up a tasting. She had 7 different vats of Chardonnay, 3 vats of Chenin Blanc, 1 vat of Pinot Noir. So we were tasting through those. As we were tasting through those, I asked Joe, why have we not been using Cabernet Franc in the blend? Because being very eager and keen and new to the society, I've looked at and done my research and seen that in about 2010, we had been using 5 to 10% Cabernet Franc in the wine, but we hadn't for the last 5 years. And Joe and Florence looked at each other and they didn't actually have an answer to that. So Florence raced off to the vats and she brought up 2 Cabernet Franc vats. There were samples of 2 different Cabernet Franc vats, and we tasted that. We then tasted through, we looked at the quality of the wine, but as I said, the style of the wine is fairly stable in that it's nearly always 50% Chardonnay, 35 to 45% Chenin Blanc, and then the rest made up with the red grapes, Cabernet Franc and Pinot Noir. So about an hour and a half of tasting later, we came up with this final blend, which was 50% Chardonnay, 40% Chenin Blanc, 5% Pinot Noir, and 5% Cabernet Franc. So blending is such an important consideration. You are allowed other grape varieties. Cabernet Sauvignon and Gros are allowed, as is Au Bois, which is another white variety. But for Cremonte Loire, you are very likely to see that they're dominated by Chardonnay and Chenin Blanc. Cremonte Loire as an appellation was granted status in 1975, and its rules are pretty similar to most other Cremont regions. So only manual harvesting is allowed, no machine picking, and the wines must be aged on lees for at least 12 months. So that lees aging is really crucial. You'll find sparkling wines in other regions of the world, they'll have a shorter time of permitted time on lees. And what that is it's aging the wine in contact with the yeast cells. And those yeast cells, as they're going through the process of fermentation, have an impact on the wine and give the wines that biscuity, brioche, toast characteristic, which is so synonymous with sparkling wine. If we just go back to that map of the Loire, most of the sparkling Cremonte Loires are based around Saumur and Anjou. So you can see Saumur, the big black dot there. Famous Saumur Champagny for the dry table wines, the red wines from Cabernet Franc. But yeah, also the predominant region for sparkling wine in the Loire. You can of course have Brut Saumur, which is a variation of Cremonte Loire, whereas Cremonte Loire covers the whole region. If we go to this photo, you can actually see there the Gratiot building and just why Saumur is so well suited to making sparkling wine. You have the river running along. This is looking south. You have the plateau that's been, the river is really driven through. And then the plateau on top where you've got quite flat lands, well suited to make growing the vines that go into the wines. So you've got a rather modern winery planted as you go up the hill. At the bottom, there's a lovely old chateau. And I saw a couple of comments about people visiting there. I know it's a very well trodden path for Wine Society members to travel through. call in on their way to other regions of France potentially. But yeah, I know it's a very well-trodden path and a much loved place to visit for many members. Anna, you have the wine open. What do you think of it?
I love it. I think it's complex is probably the wrong word, but there's definitely different kinds of fruit going on from the first. So for me, it was kind of crisper, a bit more green apple when the DOP had been a bit more of that yellowy plummy flavor. So it definitely has a bit more zing for me, which is perfect, and a bit more acidity as well, actually, potentially. But I had a question for you from Roger, Tim, which is you'll have to answer it as best you can, but it does sound like, by the way, you are instrumental in the Cabernet Franc being in this. So there we go, take the praise. But Roger said, how do you blend a wine and taste it reliably when it's going to be fizzy one day? Because you are blending still wines, right?
Exactly. So you just, when you are blending the wines, the wines have gone through the first fermentation process. So you've got a base wine. And you're trying those wines, and it is rather difficult. I must admit, it was my first experience in doing it. The wines are high in acidity. They're quite different to what you expect from a normal dry wine. So I can really only say it's through experience, and yeah, through a lot of tasting. I must admit, I found it quite confronting. You mentioned about the acidity and your teeth. It was one that was really, really quite confronting, I must admit, the first time. The reason why we did include the Cabernet Franc this year, 2017 was a difficult year for the Loire. There was a lot of frost, so like this year that they're experiencing. But what that meant was that yields were lower and there was great concentration. So it actually turned out to be a pretty good year for Cabernet Franc. Not much quantity, but the quality was there. And it just had this real red fruit and brought a little bit of what we thought would be a bit more richness, and give the wine a little bit more of structure. So that was why we included it this year.
Great. And I managed to wangle a trip to Champagne with Sarah Knowles, and we were invited to taste some Van Clair wines in Champagne, i.e. they get fizzy and get all the bits added to them. And she said, I don't do it because it's so hard to predict. And there's all sorts of science that goes on when the fizz happens, that she chooses not to taste the Van Clair wines, which is, she does occasionally, but she says she finds it really, really hard. And she's our MW Champagne buyer, so dark arts.
Very, very much so. But yeah, Florence, who's the head of the Loire operation for Gautier, she's a former engineer, but just a really passionate producer of sparkling wines. And she's traveled around the world. She's done multiple vintages each year to try to fast track her education experience. And I think this wine, it's, as you say, it's complex enough to be interesting, but approachable and pleasant for even the less serious sparkling wine aficionados.
Absolutely. Conscious of time, and it leads us, I guess, quite nicely on to the next wine, Tim, the Montbourgoux. So I'll allow you to carry on, and I'll disappear and enjoy wine number 2.
Sure. So we're now heading east over to the Jura, which is located between Burgundy and Switzerland. So one visit, if you can, fly to Geneva, drive to Beaune, but visit the Jura on your way through. It's one of the most spectacular drives I've ever completed. Really think it's a must do for any not just wine lover, but anyone that enjoys amazing scenery. But I must admit, up until I visited, the Jura was a region that I really had a love-hate relationship with. I love their cheeses. There's some amazing cheeses from the region, but I wasn't a big fan of Jura wines, predominantly because my experience up until that point was only the Vin Jaune, the famous yellow wine of the region, which is made in a oxidative style, a little bit like sherry, and can be quite a polarizing wine. And I must admit, it was one that I really didn't enjoy until you get to go there and you see it in its native home, and then I had a whole new appreciation for it. So that's what it's famous for, the region, the Jura, the Vin Jaune, but it does actually make a significant amount of sparkling wine. Cremonte Jura makes up over 25% of all Jura wine production. We should have a map of the region, hopefully coming up, where we can see it. Wonderful. So you can see from the south Saint-Amour going up through Beaufort, so some famous cheese names there that we're maybe more familiar with. And then we have La Torre, which is the yellow bit there, which is where this wine's based. And it is, but what's really crucial to this wine is it's called a Blanc De Blanc. It's 100% Chardonnay. There are 5 grape varieties permitted in the making of production of Cremont de Jura, Chardonnay and Sauvignon being the 2 white grapes, and then Pinot Noir, Pulsard, and Chasseau for the red grapes. But this is a Blanc de Blanc, and it's 100% Chardonnay. There's no Sauvignon included in the blend. But what's really crucial in this particular wine, and what the focus is the fact that it's labelled as a Brut Zero. It's got 0 dosage. Now, dosage is the process of topping up the wine to replace what has been lost after disgorgement. So the method traditionnel that Anna was discussing, a base wine goes through fermentation. They then add yeast. That yeast ferments again, producing the sparkling wine. But what they will do at the end of that is to remove those dead yeast cells. It doesn't sound particularly attractive, but these dead yeast cells are in the bottle. They will normally freeze the top of the bottle, take off the cap. The wine will then be topped up, and that topping up is called dosage. And they'll use that topping up the wine with more wine, but that wine might be containing some concentrated grape must, or can even be bolstered with some extra alcohol. So they might use cognac to top it up. So that wine, they will often sweeten the wine just to try to get a little bit of balance and just make the wine a little bit more attractive or approachable. But this particular wine is a Brut Zero, so 0 dosage. So they do not add any sugars when they, topping up this wine. If we look, if we've got a picture here of Nicole, the winemaker, who, as I said, was the winemaker that decided to move. This one was just a brut wine. It was a dry wine, but she's decided to transfer it to a brut dosage. 0 dosage, a Brut Zero wine. So really looking for a dry, crisp, racy wine. This Chardonnay gives it that lovely minerality. Nicole, as a region, Marcel, our buyer for the region, calls it the Chablis of the Jura. It's got soils that are dominated by limestone, but they have these fossil starfishes. There's a picture a little bit later which shows these fossilized starfish that are contained within the soils. Now, minerality is a dangerous word to mention in the world of wine. A lot of critics will say that you can't taste any wines, but can't taste it in wines. But when you taste this wine, I think it has a real raciness or edginess or energy to it. Anna, I know you've got it open. What do you think of it?
I certainly do. I think for me, this is probably, and there is another wine that might contend with it that I haven't tried yet this evening, but I think for me, this was the one I was expecting to be the most competitive with champagne in style. I think naturally you've got the grape that goes, the main white grape that goes into champagne, Chardonnay, and Brut Zero, whilst not many champagnes are actually made in Brut Zero style, because it's so much further north and has more acidity, it needs a bit more sugar, but that kind of austere flavor is really coming through. It's a serious wine. It's the kind of wine where you could maybe trick someone into thinking it might be champagne. I think it's delicious, and actually this pre-Brut Zero and now it's Brut Zero is a tastings team favorite. I know Emma Briffett, who's on maternity leave at the moment, this is her go-to instead of champagne. She said she'd much rather have a few bottles of this. Yeah,
but I can understand members that might find it just a little bit too edgy, too racy. It's not if you're not a fan of acidity, if you don't like green apples that biting into that right Granny Smith and you get that tingle, because this wine is very high in acidity and it is on that racy side. So I wouldn't call this a crowd pleaser type of wine. Anna, you've got a wedding coming up. I wouldn't, I don't know, I'm assuming you're not using it, but it's not a wine I'd use for an event like that.
Agreed. It's a wine you know about. You don't, it's not a quaffing in the garden wine for sure.
Yeah.
We have had a question. I think maybe we can just quickly clarify before we move on, Tim. Susan McCrum has asked, is there a second fermentation in a Brut Zero?
Yeah, so absolutely. So you start with the base wine, it goes to fermentation. You then add your little parcel of yeasts and nutrients into the bottle. That then goes to the secondary fermentation, the byproduct of that obviously being bubbles. And then at the end of that, that's when you freeze the bottle, you remove those dead yeast cells, and you would normally top up with a little bit of sugar. But with a Brut Zero, when you're topping up at that final stage before bottling the final bottle, you're just not adding any sugar at that level. So it's exactly the same. It's still method traditional, secondary fermentation in the bottle that you're buying, just no sugar added at that final stage.
Yeah, because in the second fermentation, Susan, so in that fermentation that happens in the bottle, the sugar that is added into that second fermentation will be eaten by the yeast and converted into more alcohol and bubbles. So it's effectively like saying when at no point are we adding any sugar that will be left in the bottle. Lovely. I think that's my favorite so far, but I do think, yeah, it's a challenge because it wouldn't be something you can easily swig back all evening, but love to know what members think if they have any thoughts. Are you happy for me to move on, Tim?
Yeah, so they were the pre-bottling processes, so the blending and then the dosage that we wanted to focus on with the method traditional. And as I said, that period of time on lees is so central to quality sparkling wine production. And for the Loire and the Jura, both by law stated that it has to be minimum 12 months. But in both cases, these wines go a little bit beyond that. So the Cremonte Loire, the celebration, is 15 months, and the Jura is 18 months on lees.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm going to start my next section, if it's all right, with a question, because we've just been on talking about the Jura and its similarity to Champagne. And for anybody who's a big Cremont fan, they will notice that there's a big gaping hole in this session. There's a big gaping hole in our list. And that is Cremont de Bourgogne, so Burgundy Cremont, which is incredibly popular. Those are all the Champagne grapes. So they use they use mainly Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. They can use Pinot Meunier, but the reality is that they don't really, they're allowed to, but they don't really use the Champagne grapes quite so much. So you're actually more likely to get things like Gamay or Auxerrois that they could use as a, sorry, I tell a lie, Melon de Bourgogne, not Auxerrois. That was in the Alsace wine. Melon de Bourgogne, which is a easier to grow grape variety. Now, the gaping gap is on purpose. I asked Toby Morale why we don't do a Cremont de Bourgogne, and I asked because I thought, well, that's a very cheap alternative for my upcoming wedding, and he said that he just doesn't taste any that are worthy to put on the list. And 10 years ago that might not have been the case, because there was still a passion for making good Cremont in Burgundy, but unfortunately now, with the prices of Burgundy at such a premium, it doesn't make financial sense to use very good grapes to go into your Cremont. So the Cremont will be things that perhaps don't fit into the stricter regulations of the area, and all those sorts of things. So they tend to be slightly lesser quality wines. So I hope, Kate, that answers your question. I have pestered Toby on it, our buyer for Cremont, but it's just until he finds one that he thinks is worthy, it's not going to happen. The ones that are worthy that I've tried are £30 plus, and then you start to get into Champagne price points anyway. So you would argue that is it a good idea, let's say. But I can tell you an alternative. Well, not the next one, but the one after, but they're both from the same region. So I've got the pleasure of doing the fourth and fifth wine. And these are my favorite wines, and we are hoping to serve 2 sparkling wines at the wedding, one South African, but also we are hoping to serve a Cremonte de Limoux, which is wine number 5. So let's talk about 4 first, and I'll tell you a little bit about the Limoux region. I'll show you the bottle if you are tasting at home. This is the Blanquette version, and I'll tell you why the difference in a minute. But both of these wines are produced by Maison Antèche, and they are based in the Limoux region of southern France. So this region is close to the sea-ish. It's not on the seaside, but it's close enough to, there you go, you can see down there. But it is in the south. It's further south technically than Marseille. It's further south than Nice, than Cannes. You would think it would be too warm to grow good grapes here, and grapes with good acidity. We had a comment in the chat about why acidity is important in sparkling wine. Sparkling wines are designed to be refreshing and light and pleasing and pleasant. And if they don't have decent acidity, they can actually be a very strange combination of fizzy and flabby. And nobody wants fizz and flab. It's not good. So in order to get this beautiful freshness and acidity, luckily Limoux has some altitude. So all the vines are at least 100 meters above sea level, but most of them are more like 400. And that height gives the lovely freshness, and it also gives a nice diurnal range. So in the evenings it's very cool, and then in the daytime when the sun heats it up, it's a bit warmer. And that diurnal range also adds complexity to the grape varieties. So you're actually in a bit of a strange, perfect little microclimate here. It's in the foothills of the Pyrenees, arguably, and then just south of Carcassonne. So again, anybody planning any trips, be it this year, next year, whenever you think you can, it's a really great region to visit. There's about 2,000 hectares of vines in Limoux across around 40 villages. Lots of small producers, which is lovely, but Maison Antèche is by far the largest, and we've been working with them for 25 years. Beautiful 6th generation family. There are a few co-ops, but not really. We're talking small co-ops. The production is small, and if you haven't heard of Limoux before, they also make beautiful whites and red wines under the appellation as well, and I can't sing its praises highly enough. They're gorgeous wines. But from my opinion, most importantly, the fun thing about Limoux is this is again a little mini history lesson, because this is where sparkling wine started. So those monks I mentioned at the beginning, and they were from this region. So it's supposed that it started here. There's some argument as to whether there were monks traveling around swapping stories, but it certainly began here. The first documented sparkling fizz was produced in the Limoux region. As I mentioned, Maison Antèche, 25 years of history, but we have a new wonderful woman, Francois, at the helm. So Francois Antèche has taken over, 6th generation, as I said, and she has got one mission, and that is to promote the local grape variety. And that is the grape variety that must be the main grape in the Blanquette style of sparkling wine from Limoux. So I think we have a slide of the 3 different styles that she makes. Here we go. And I've nicked this from her, so I'm sure she won't mind. But we have the AOC Blanquette de Limoux and traditional method, of course, 90% Mauzac minimum. So that's what we're tasting today. This is actually Mauzac and Chenin. And then there is the Cremonte Loire. That's the next wine. So if you have it, don't sneak too quickly yet. But we will be tasting a Cremonte Loire, also traditional method. But here we go on to the more classic grape varieties. So Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and then a touch of Chenin, which is obviously a combination that we found up in the Loire. But then there is a final variety, and a final method of production, and I'm not going to go too much into this because actually this is the production method of the final wine that Tim's going to talk about. But this method ancestral is the historical original style of winemaking from the Limoux region. So those 3 beautiful styles of wine, and if you are a sparkling wine fan, I can't think of anything better than just spending a day traipsing around Limoux trying different versions of sparkling wine from the region. So if you have got the Antec Limoux Reserve 2017, that's the one that I'm about to taste now. And I'll tell you a tiny bit about it. But as you know already from that, it has to be 90% Mauzac. And Mauzac is a grape variety, brings a bit of sort of bruised apple. It's definitely got a bit more of less of a fresh fruit character, which I think is really interesting. And it's slightly honeyed as well. So a tiny, not sweet, don't worry, you're not going to have a sweet wine, but it has got that kind of honeyed note to it. If you have got both of the wines, then I do recommend trying them side by side, or at least smelling them. But this has seen 15 months in a barrel, and Tim mentioned the dosage. There's 10 grams per litre in this wine. I should also mention that most Cremonts will age nicely for 1 to 3 years. Now, some of these that we've had are 2017, so you're already, if we're selling them now and they're 2017, these are going to be better quality than your average Cremonts, because being able to age a Cremont once it's been in the bottle for, you know, around 5 years, which is our recommended for these wines, is certainly a sign of its quality. Also, bottle aging is different to lees aging. So Tim spoke about the the lees adding that yeasty flavour, because effectively the wine is sitting in amongst the dead yeast cells. So of course it's going to be bready and doughy. When the disgorgement's happened, so when we've taken all of those dead yeast cells out and we've put the proper cork in and it's just sat in a bottle, it will still age. It ages slower than normal whites and red wines, just naturally it does, but it will still age. And these slightly older vintages for Cremonts should have a bit more complexity, but it's not going to be the same dough and yeast that you get from long periods sat on the lees. If you've instead sat on the lees for a long time in the bottle, you're going to add things like nuts. And that's why I get this lovely honeyed nut thing as well from this wine. So that's the Blanquette. If you are lucky to have them both side by side, then the Cremont is slightly different. Some of you will have 2017, some will have 2018. You will see there is a price change. Now, we don't actually write the full name of this wine on the website. It's probably too long. But this particular wine is a Brut Millésime. So it's a Brut in style, i.e. low sugar. This is 8 grams per litre dosage. But it's a Millésime, so it's a Cuvée Millésime, one of their better blends. Millésime actually means year of harvest, so you tend to only see Cremonts that have a year, so 2017, 2018 being the Millésime or the top wines. But it does mean that they've made an exceptional blend. You may have spotted there as well, it's had longer on the lees, so it had 30 months compared to 15 for the first wine. You can only really age a wine even longer if it's a better quality wine. If you put rubbish wine in a bottle on the lees for longer, it won't get complex. It will just end up tasting of no fruit and just bread. So if you're looking for qualities in Cremonts, unfortunately price will factor in, but £17 for a top cuvee of a Cremont I think is not bad. You will look for how long it's been on the lees. Obviously you can choose the style, but the longer the lees tends to mean that a better quality wine went into it. And how long will it drink for if it's a vintage? So this is a 2018, and I think if we flash it back up, I'm sure Joe said 2022, and that's the most conservative thing I've ever heard, because this is a wine that could age for 10 years if you wanted to drink it in a more mature style. 2024, well, I would argue she's been very, very conservative. You'll also notice, and this is why I mentioned it earlier, that this is a Chardonnay wine. So there is a little bit of Pinot Noir and a little bit of Chenin, but this is majority Chardonnay. So for me, this is the wine that I thought was going to compete with the wine from the Jura in terms of a sort of champagne quality, similar to, and a champagne replica in all senses of the word. But really lovely. It's not as punchy as the Jura. This is just a lovely picture to finish on, but it just goes to show what a gorgeous region Limoux is. For me, it's a really interesting wine region as well, because it's covered in trees and oaks, and it's not just wine. You're really getting into the kind of Pyrenees, Spanish border as you start to get down here. So it doesn't really look too much like other parts of France, and I think that's really special. So yes, Tim, you've tried this wine before, haven't you? Oh, you're on mute. Sorry, Tim.
Sorry about that. I have indeed. I'm a big fan of it. It's you get caught up in the story and you're tasting history, but there's just so much depth of flavor and concentration of fruit. And yeah, I think it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous wine.
I think for me, this is a bit friendlier than the Jura. I don't know whether members would agree, but it's definitely a little bit lighter in touch. You know, it's not as, I used the word austere earlier, it's maybe not as austere, but for somewhere so south and so warm, I still can't believe the acidity. It makes my mouth water. It makes me immediately want a canapé. For me, this is perfect wedding wine, both of them actually, but in particular the Heritage. You have to love the first wine for the history and the Mauzac grape and everything like that. But the second wine for me is a really it's just a showstopper actually.
Anna, we've had a question about aging Cremont wines. Can they be aged as long as champagne?
So, good question. Rubbish champagne shouldn't be aged at all. So, a cheap champagne you should drink within the year. And ideally when you've already had a few glasses of something else so you don't notice it. But, and you could say the same for Cremont. A cheap Cremont and a poorly made Cremont also should be drunk within a year. The same for most Proseccos. When you start to look at quality, and as I mentioned, looking for things like the special cuvées for houses, when you start to look at when they put a vintage, i.e. the grapes from that year have been very good. So rather than a non-vintage blend, when there's a vintage on the label, those are the wines that you can start to think about aging for longer. I also mentioned the longer on the lees. The lees actually acts a little bit like a vaccine is the way to describe it actually. So if you imagine when you've got wine sat with dead yeast cells eating it, they're manipulating the oxygen levels, they're doing things to the wine. You know, they're changing its behavior in that, changing its makeup, its DNA in that second fermentation. That actually acts as a bit of a future proofer. So the longer you have the wine on those dead yeast cells and you have that interaction, sort of vaccinates it a little bit for the rest of its life. And you'll find the same in champagne. Longer lees aged wines tend to then have a longer life once they get onto the shelves. So yes, you can, but do try and get the better quality ones. And realistically, I wouldn't age a Cremont for over 10 years, but then I'm sure there's probably really fine Cremonts that I've not tried, and somebody out there will prove me wrong. Please do. Send in your postcards. I'd love to try a 40-year-old Cremont.
And one trick, if you do open a wine that has been aged and you found it a little bit, it's lost its life and it's lost its energy, just open a fresh bottle and then blend it. Champagne, sparkling wine, we call it a blend of a blend because you're blending different grape varieties and often different vintages. You can do that yourself. So if you have a particularly old wine and you find it's just lost its life, a little dash of a fresh sparkling wine can bring that back to life, but you still got the age complexity of the older wine. So little trick there.
I've not heard that before, Tim. Is that an Australian thing?
No, it's a well-known champagne trick, particularly with vintage champagnes, because people do tend to age them too long. It's not something I'd recommend with a bog standard non-vintage that's gone too long. But if you've got a wine that has great structure and great quality and components to it, but it's just lost that fizz and you like that fizz of champagne or sparkling wine, you can bring that back in just by a little bit of a pep up.
Perfect. I love that idea. Although I'm not in the market for drinking huge amounts of vintage sparkling wines that I've aged too long. They don't last long.
Exactly.
So it's a good idea, but I'm not sure I'll ever use it. Thank you.
I've never seen a wine go 1 year too old in your house, let alone more. So
Indeed. Right. We're now zooming back to Method Ancestral, the style of wine originated in the Antèche region, right, Tim?
Indeed. So yeah, it's the original process of making sparkling wine. And I'm going to be sharing the details of this last wine, which Anna has on screen there. A lovely color. Unfortunately, I didn't get a bottle. I used my bottle in the preparation of the notes. So I don't have a bottle to enjoy tonight, but it's a lovely looking wine. And you can see there on the sweetness scale, it's listed as a 4 out of 9, a medium off-dry wine. And that's because of the process that this wine's gone through, that Method Ancestral. But before we get on to that, where is Bougie, the region, Bougie Cerdon? If we bring up the map, we can see just where it sits. I've added, so there you've got Bougie just to the west of Chambéry, a lovely place to visit again, so between Chambéry and Lyon. But the entire region goes up to north, up to Sedan there, so just to the west of Geneva. On our website, we do actually list this as a Jura Savoy wine, but it's not. Bougie Sedan is its own appellation. But to give you a bit of context, you can see where the Cremonta Alsace, Cremonte Loire wine was made just further north. So it gives you a bit of context. About an hour's drive from the Geneva. This wine is made wholly in the Sedan region, which you can see there. And we've got a close-up view of the region coming up next. So you can see in the kind of the valley there, surrounded by hills, the vines are planted on quite steep slopes, which are well suited to vine production. And here it's a blend of 85% Gamay and 15% Pulsard. There are more varieties permitted in the region, but this producer, Carve Wojciak, if we have any people with Polish language skills, I apologize for my pronunciation there. But yeah, they use 85% Gamay and 15% Pulsar. Are considering planting Chardonnay and some other varieties, but at the moment that's what they have. Now, Pulsar is a fragile and quite difficult grape to grow, much harder to grow than Gamay, which is a little bit more forgiving. And it produces quite large, sweet, juicy grapes that add quite a rich aromatic note to the wine. Also has a bit of delicacy. But whilst that grape is quite aromatic and can add fruit sweetness, the sweetness in this wine isn't so much from that, it's from the method of production, that method ancestral. Now, what is method ancestral? It starts off with fermentation in the same way as a traditional sparkling wine, so the traditional method. But here, the first fermentation isn't completed. They stop it, and they do that by lowering the temperature of the vats with the wine that's going through that fermentation. So they'll lower that to down below 10 degrees, and that will stop the yeast converting the sugars into alcohol. So as a result, you're left with a base wine that has lower alcohol level, but more sweetness. That's the classic fermentation process. If you stop a fermentation early, you're left with more sugars, lower alcohol. That wine is then filtered. It's bottled and put into a bottle and stored with some yeast still. They don't actually remove all of the yeast. So then when that wine warms up, the yeast that's still in the wine that had been put to sleep, I guess, it had been, it's like putting some crabs in the freezer before you cook them. That doesn't actually kill off the yeast, it just mutes them and puts them on hold. So then when the wine warms up again, that yeast starts to go through fermentation again. The yeast starts to eat the remaining sugar to produce the bubbles, the byproduct of that fermentation process, the bubbles being produced. So after 2 months of it being going through that secondary fermentation with it warmed as the wine has been warmed, the bottles are then opened, emptied, cleaned, and filled again. But because, unlike with secondary fermentation where you're adding extra yeast in, and as I mentioned, adding that extra yeast allows the alcohol content of the wine to be beefed up because the yeast are able to convert more of those sugars into alcohol. Because it doesn't have any extra yeast added, the alcohol of this wine stays lower. And because that first fermentation was cut early, it stays sweeter. So this wine, I think, is 7.5% alcohol. And as we've got it on the sweetness scale, it's an off-dry 4 out of 9 sweetness on the scale. And you've got it open. Tell me what you're experiencing with it.
I love it. We've just had somebody ask whether about Lambrisco and whether there's anything similar. I should mention that not all wines, from Bougie are made in this style. This is the method ancestral style is the one that will make it sweeter. So yes, you can get dry versions, but this particularly sweet style is bordering on a Lambrisco for me. But it's so much better. Sorry, Sarah Knowles. And And Tim, I know that you've got your Aussie sparkling Shiraz, but nothing compares. This is heaven. I'm not a sweet wine drinker, or I am, but with blue cheese. So I have a very strict, I need my sweet things to be added salty. This, to me, I've been told before, and I've never tried it, and it's now going to happen tomorrow morning, but I've been told that this particular wine is great with a bacon sandwich and tomato ketchup, and I can understand why. It's got enough sweetness that the salty bacon will work, but it's also got a lovely freshness, and the bubbles really do sort of refresh you. So actually the fattiness of the bacon will not be cloying in the mouth, because you've got this lovely little sparkle. For a more traditional pairing, you might want to go with something like strawberries, but I would go, oh look, Kath Brown says, I agree, Anna, excellent for breakfast. That is the other added bonus. The lower alcohol makes it a really, really good breakfast wine. But I wasn't even thinking about the alcohol, I was thinking about the bacon. But it's so light, it's refreshing. It's the kind of wine where you drink it and you smile. It's not a sparkling rosé dry style from the Loire. It's sort of softer, sweeter, very, very easy. So if you haven't tried it, I know we're sold out now. It's the only wine I think we're fully sold out of. But I would highly recommend when it comes back in stock to keep your eyes peeled, because it's worth it, even if you only like one. Even if you only try one and you never go back again, it's still worth it just to have experienced it.
Absolutely. To me, it's rather than comparing to Lambrisco, I think it's a little bit closer to Moscato d'Asti, but it's that lovely fruitiness that you've got, that strawberries and that fruit salad. So to me, breakfast is a great time, especially with a hangover. That little bit of sugar can just help your body adapt. So with the bacon sandwich, I can go with that, or just an afternoon pickup. If summer days, if you've got guests and you just want a bit of energy to the party, slip a bottle of this into your mid-afternoon after a long lunch, and it's a lovely lovely bit of pep to your day.
It's a little bit of jack of all trades, because it's got a tiny bit of tannin and that kind of crunchy red fruit, but it's also got the sweet fruits. It's slightly fizzy, but not too fizzy. So yeah. Apparently it's due the 17th of May, so perfect for the second May bank holiday.
Absolutely.
Even though it's not available. Oh, could we show the picture again, Gil, if that's all right, just so that everyone can see what they're looking for? Just the picture of the website if possible. But I cannot recommend it highly enough. If you said to me, oh, there we go, order now, 17th of May. If you said to me, please pick one wine that every member should try from this evening, it's this one.
So Mr. Pierce is convinced. Fizzy red wine at less than 8% alcohol with a bacon sandwich, no thank you. But you have little faith, Mr. Pierce. If you try it and you don't like it, you can then come, but until you try it, don't knock it.
The strawberries would work a treat as well. It's a picnic wine. Lovely. We do have a couple of questions, so I think maybe if we answer two of those, Tim, and I'm conscious we're probably going to run slightly over. But the first question is around English wine. So if I could ask you, Tim, somebody has asked, how do these wines compare to the English varieties? And I think they mean such at Rathfinney, who obviously is a classic English sparkling wine producer. So how do these compare to English sparkling wines?
English sparkling wines are traditionally made using the Champagne grape variety. So the three main Champagne grape varieties, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. You do see a lot of English sparkling wine being made with Bacchus and other grape varieties, but really the majority of the quality wines are the traditional method using the traditional grapes. So wines like the Jura with the 100% Chardonnay are not dissimilar. Jura has quite a high altitude, so you're keeping a lot of acidity. So it's got, a similar structure and framework is what you get with the English wines. What we're finding with the English sparkling wines are they have that natural high acidity, but what we've had in the last couple of years are some really nice warmer summers, which have allowed the grapes to ripen more fully, and you're getting the fruit to go with it. Not dissimilar. I think I'm a huge fan of English sparkling wines. I think critics will say that they're more expensive. They kind of match champagne on price as opposed to the Cremont wines, but I think the quality is there to match it. So I'd say compared to a good Cremont from the Jura or from Alsace or the Loire, quite similar. But I do think the English sparkling wines have a real unexplored potential yet. The quality is only going one way, and yeah, I think a lot more to be seen from them.
There are as well sort of less frequently available, but they do exist, some other varieties of sparkling too, so made from things like Blanc and some more unusual varieties. I think the one that I'm seeing more and more frequently is Pinot Blanc, which is becoming quite popular. It's quite easy to, well, it's easier to grow here than some of the other varieties. Pinot Noir, for example, can be really tricky to grow, so Pinot Blanc sometimes a little easier. So there are also pardon me, English nuances or other types, but I think the core of English sparkling wine is exactly as Tim described, which is this traditional method, champagne varieties. Okie dokes. Now we have a question I'm not 100% sure of the answer on, which is from Richard Rees saying, I love Cremonte Loire, but why does it seem to be so popular with the Wine Society and on the shelves more than the other Cremonts?
So yeah, certainly some of the other regions have seen a real boom in popularity with the supermarkets. So I know some of the certainly Aldi's and Lidl's have really explored and done very well with their Cremonta Alsace and Cremonte Juras. Cremonte Loire, as Anna said, Alsace is second in terms of amount of production in sparkling wine regions in France. So it's the most of the Cremont regions. But in terms of importing into the UK, it's actually the Cremonte Loire which has the most. So we at the Society, the celebration has just always been such a popular wine for our members. So yeah, I don't know. We do have the others, obviously not the Bourgogne as Anna explained. We do have the others, but often our list is dictated by members. It's not there's a little bit of we try to lead members astray and let them explore new regions, but also demand does win out. So just the demand for the Loire, and in particular this wine, which we've got such a great relationship with the producer, that may be an influence. But yeah, that's going to be my best guess at that answer.
I love the idea that we lead members astray. The other wine that we haven't spoken about, I should say, that is on that list, that's a massive wine producing region, which we do not stock any Cremonts of, is Bordeaux. You flagged my memory there, Tim. Bordeaux Cremont is an unusual fish. It's got more, I think, more varieties permitted than any other region. Everything from Merlot, which is actually the most common grape to go into Cremont de Bordeaux, Merlot, right through to Sauvignon Blanc. It's the only region that allows Sauvignon Blanc. Even the Loire, famous for Sauvignon of Sancerre, etc., does not allow it. Yeah, you can see it here. Semillon, Sauvignon Gris, Colombard, Merlot Blanc. I mean, I don't think I've ever tasted a Merlot Blanc in my life, but you can put one in a Cremont de Bordeaux. So it's worth noting there's method to our madness in what we list in some senses, and I think, having not spoken to Tim about it, mainly because I've not been on the search for a Bordeaux Cremont, but I imagine that again they're more of a local drink for those ones, you know, less exported. I've had a few in my time and I've not been wildly impressed. And I think the only thing I'd add to Tim's comment about why so many Loire is maybe, and this is a big maybe, we are a bit more familiar with some of the flavors, because there is Chardonnay and Pinot and even Chenin, actually, because we haven't spoken about sparkling Vouvray, for example, which has been historically very popular in the UK, and those varieties. So I think maybe the English palate is also a little bit more accustomed to some of those.
And as Karen Woods has just put in the chat, I think it's as I said earlier, it's a well trodden path. So a lot of members go through and visit. We hear the stories of the boots being loaded on the way back through. So yeah, potentially that's a reason as well. There was a call for potentially putting these wines together into a mixed case, and that's something that happens with a lot of our events. So I just thought quickly I'd explain that is something we are hoping to offer more of. Currently, though, with demand being so high, our warehouse really is struggling to keep up with demand. So in order to get mixed cases together, it's actually quite labor intensive, and it's very difficult to predict the demand. So we haven't been putting mixed cases together. We're relying on members to have to click through the website and order the separate wines for events. But it is something we're hoping to offer more of as we go forward. You'll see with the AGM event, we've got a special selection of just those 3 wines. So that is something to look forward to. And the other thing to look forward to is we're hoping to offer more. What we're very excited to be launching very soon are the taste and sample kits, where we'll be offering members the chance to buy a kit of 6 wines with 50 mils of each wine, so that you can really taste along with all the wines that we're tasting without opening too many wines, without feeling pressure to drink too much.
What do you mean, Tim? I'm not under any pressure at all. It's bank holiday weekend.
But that is something, to look out for. We've been waiting many months to get the technology all lined up. So, and also testing the wines just to make sure that it is the wines will be at the quality that we want members to enjoy. So a lot of practice has gone into it, but we're very excited to be launching those soon.
Absolutely. We'll finish on one question, if that's all right, because it's actually a good one, and one that I should have addressed probably much earlier on. But that is, which glasses are best to serve fizz in? Now, not these is the answer, but it's the only one I had 6 of that were clean. But yes, it really does depend. The more complex the wine, you tend to want a wider base and a sort of tulip shape. You can, of course, serve Cremont in a flute, should you wish. You won't get as many aromas, but it will stay fizzy for longer. So for me, if I was drinking the DOP on a sunny day, wine number 1, wanting something light and refreshing and continuing to keep it fizzy, then I would most definitely serve that in a flute. For the Jura, for example, where there's a lot going on and I want to maybe appreciate it, I'd have actually popped that in a wine glass. So a big one. A red wine glass.
Glassware and temperature can make a big impact on your enjoyment of a wine. So if you're finding a wine too acidic and too harsh, let that wine warm up and you might find more fruit start to develop. If you find the white too blousy and too flabby, serve it cooler and you might find it just adds a little bit more freshness to the wine. So you can taste and experiment within a bottle of wine. You don't just have to try different wines to experiment.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all members for coming. Sorry for running over. We enjoyed ourselves too much as usual. Hopefully we haven't eaten too much into your bank holiday weekend. I will be sending a follow-up email. I'll put links to all of the wines in, so whilst we can't do a full kit, hopefully we'll make it nice and easy for you to click on. And yes, I hope you have a fantastic bank holiday weekend. Thanks.
Just a big thank you to Gil for tonight being in the background doing all the sharing and everything. It's a difficult job, but he's done a stellar effort as always.
Absolutely. And Gil, in the future, when we can meet up, we'll share. On these evenings, we'll be sharing the rest and going into the long bank holiday weekend like that. So cheers, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Bye.